Hi everyone. It's nice to see you, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Cynthia Kinnan today. So maybe we can, I don't know if you want to start with slides or if you want to share the slides with us.
Yeah, I'll do that. Let's see here.
Again, for those, yeah, perfect. So for those who have not been attending before, so we'll ask the participants to write their questions in the Q&A, and we'll call you. I mean, I'll manage this Q&A box, and I'll read your questions to Professor Cynthia. So she'll tell us then today about this paper on that asks the question of, can microfinance unlock a poverty trap for some entrepreneurs? So the floor is yours, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, this is part of a kind of a research agenda that I've been working on now for quite a while, and you know, this is, I think, at least to me, is a really interesting piece of the puzzle of thinking about overall kind of understanding of the effects of financial access for the poor. And so I'm really excited to share this with you, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and feedback. And you know, I think as Katya said, you know, please feel free to jump in throughout with questions and comments. I'm looking forward to those comments. So I would be remiss not to say that this is joint work with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo at MIT and Emily Breza at Harvard. Let's see. Oh, I gotta get my mouse. There we go. Okay, so in a sense, as you can guess from the fact that the poverty trap is in the title, this paper is in some ways related to the search for poverty traps. And so before I go on, let me just just to make sure that we're all on the same page, let me clarify a little bit what I mean by a poverty trap. So I'll show you a graphical illustration on the next slide. But by a poverty trap, just thinking about a dynamic process wherein the state today affects the state tomorrow in a way that can give rise to multiple steady states. In particular, that there could be a low steady state, which the poverty trap referenced, and then also a possible higher steady state, so that two individuals or two entities with the same underlying fundamentals, but just starting at different initial conditions, may wind up at very different long-run outcomes, one possibly corresponding to the low steady state or the poverty trap, and one corresponding to the kind of Pareto better steady state, the non-poverty trap state. So, and again, I know that for this audience, I don't need to, this isn't going to be a hard sell, but, so as you all know, both policymakers and development economic researchers are interested in looking for and trying to find poverty traps, because if we think that the state of the world is one characterized by poverty traps or multiple equilibria, then that suggests that a one-time big push that changes individuals' wealth or capital or the whatever the underlying state variable may be, may have the potential to push some households, some businesses into a permanently higher equilibrium, may move them from the poverty trap equilibrium to the better equilibrium. So that suggests again that there can be large payoffs from one-time interventions if those short-term interventions are large enough. Okay, so here, as promised, is just a simple graphical example that that will probably look familiar to many of you, but just to kind of make sure that we're on the same page. So here on the x-axis we have the level of the state variable. So let's think of it here as assets at time t, and here on the y-axis we have the level of assets at time t plus 1. So we have kind of this period and next period, and this with apologies to the letter S, this nonlinear shape here represents the mapping between my assets or my state today and my assets or my state tomorrow. And so as we probably remember from a class that we may have taken at one point or another, if I start at a point where this transition path lies below the 45-degree line, then that means that over time my level of assets is going to fall, and I'm eventually going to reach this attractor point A1. Okay, so and this would be what we think of as the poverty trap steady state. On the other hand, if I start at a point where the transition diagram, this nonlinear curve lies above the 45-degree line, then my assets or my state variable are going to grow over time until I reach this higher steady state A2. Okay, and so this again is the idea that if if the underlying state of the world is one where we have these types of dynamics being present, then if we could take an individual or a household who's maybe just a little bit below A bar, and we can give them a one-time transfer of assets, wealth, et cetera, that pushes them above A bar, then that would move them from a situation where they would have counterfactually been headed toward A1 and change the evolution of their state such that instead they evolve toward A2. Okay. So that's going to be the type of dynamic that we're going to be looking for in the data. And, you know, as you can probably surmise from kind of how I've been framing this, we're going to argue and I'm going to try to convince you today that we do find evidence that, at least for a particular subset of microfinance borrowers, that their behavior and their response to a microfinance intervention suggests that a poverty trap dynamics are in fact at play. Okay, so I won't, you know, again, I think I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, so I won't go into this in a lot of detail. But again, as I'm sure you know, this idea that non-convexities, poverty traps, non-linearities play a role in the persistence of poverty has this long intellectual history. You know, the earliest site I've listed here is a site of a paper by Banerjee and Newman in 1993, but this idea has an even longer intellectual history than that. And I think it also has a lot of anecdotal appeal. You know, I'm sure I know or I surmise that everyone who's here today has spent time in you know, in developing countries or in settings with where, you know, where economies are along that growth path. And I'm guessing that we all have maybe had an experience or have experienced a setting where poor entrepreneurs or poor micro entrepreneurs may use technologies that are inefficient but cheap, whereas wealthier entrepreneurs in the same general productive sector instead would use technologies that are more efficient but have a higher upfront cost. You know, so this is you know, this is a, let's see, oh, okay, that, all right, and my hyperlink didn't work, so I'm not going to press my luck there, but that was just going to show you an example of kind of like a pedal-operated sewing machine that has a low upfront cost but doesn't have a very high rate of efficiency versus a more mechanized and more efficient sewing machine that would have a higher upfront cost. Okay, and so again, you know, as I've kind of already talked about, you know, it's not a new insight that the combination of non-convexities in the production function combined with credit constraints that would make it hard for somebody to, let's say, borrow and get themselves from just below A bar to above A bar in the diagram I showed you a minute ago, that those two pieces together could give rise to a poverty trap. But until quite recently, I think a fair characterization of the empirical literature would be that rigorous empirical support for the kind of the empirical salience of poverty traps has been relatively elusive. So David McKenzie and Chris Woodruff have a paper from 2006 arguing that fixed costs on the margin of entry into entrepreneurship do not appear to be an important barrier to entry into entrepreneurship, which, as I'll say more about this later, is in no way inconsistent with what I'm going to tell you today about production non-convexities kind of going from a low capital intensity scale of operation to a high capital intensity scale of operation. Kibosky and Townsend, in their well-known Econometrica paper on the Thai Million Baht Fund program, also kind of search for and just don't empirically find a lot of evidence for poverty traps. And again, I'll come back to say a little bit about why I think we have that difference with those results. I also do want to acknowledge that just in the past year or two, there have been at least 2 other papers that I'm aware of that provide evidence complementary to ours. So there's a paper by Claire Balboni et al. Analyzing a large-scale in-kind asset transfer program and showing persistent effects of that program that are consistent with the idea of persistent effects and poverty traps. And then in a paper by Joe Kibosky, Molly Lipscomb, Virgilio Midrigan, and Carolyn Pelnick, they use data from Uganda to show that there may be non-convexities around fixed costs in purchasing land, which in their setting is a high return but fixed cost activity. Okay, so
can I ask you a question?
Oh yeah, please.
Sorry, I have not taken this class. I'm sorry, but I have a question about this credit constraints. So is there convincing evidence in this literature that it's about credit constraints that are interacting with the production non-convexities, or is it's something else correlated with wealth, such as risk aversion or ambition to grow, other than credit constraints?
Right. That's a great question, and I would argue. I mean, this is I would argue that the evidence that I'm going to show you today is some of the first evidence to show that credit constraints per se are playing a role in the persistence of poverty traps. Just to say maybe a teeny bit more about that, these other two papers that I mentioned a moment ago, neither of them evaluate a credit intervention. So in the paper by Balboni et al., they're looking at an in-kind transfer of livestock and showing that that can have persistent impacts. And then in the paper by Kabaski et al., they give individuals in Uganda the opportunity to choose between a riskier versus a safer asset, kind of capturing the idea that in the presence of non-convexities, people might actually exhibit risk-loving behavior because a lottery ticket can have the potential to move me from below a bar to above a bar. So our paper, to our knowledge, is I would argue the first to show that a credit intervention, a more kind of and to be clear, I think I see these as being very complementary pieces of evidence, but our results are going to show, and I'm going to try to convince you that what our results show is that when you give households credit, particularly microcredit, that the treatment group exhibits kind of transition dynamics and long-term changes that are hard to rationalize with any model other than a model with a poverty trap, and that are consistent with a poverty trap. Yeah, so thanks. That's helpful. Okay, so that question was fits in very very nicely right here in the talk. So what I'm going to try to convince you is that we can answer these three questions up here at the top of the slide in the affirmative, so that it does appear that these production non-convexities can give rise to poverty trap dynamics, and in particular the way that plays out in our setting is that we're going to show evidence that there are talented, high TFP, high productivity entrepreneurs who, because of a combination of having low wealth and facing credit constraints, are unable to access the efficient technologies that would allow them to earn income at a higher rate, and consequently, they start poor and they face credit constraints and they remain poor. They're stuck in that poverty trap. Okay, and so using long-term data collected on a sample that we've analyzed in other work, following up subjects in a randomized controlled trial in Hyderabad, India, what we're going to show today is that a one-time credit intervention, individuals that had greater access to credit at a point in the past, but no longer at the point when we collect this data, exhibit persistent positive effects of that past credit access. So again, the findings I'm going to show you today are going to very much be in the spirit of a one-time intervention having persistent effects. Okay. The other piece of this, which at least for me helps to understand why we are going to have more empirical success finding evidence of poverty traps where other studies have perhaps not, is that we're going to think about heterogeneity being an important piece of the story. So, and to be more concrete about that, I'm going to show a series of pieces of evidence that are going to suggest that there is, and of course this is going to be kind of a gross oversimplification, but that there's going to be, you can kind of think of two types of entrepreneurs. One type of entrepreneur, which we'll think of as what we'll call a reluctant entrepreneur. I'm open to suggestions of better names, who due to the lack of some complementary input, which you could think of as lacking, managerial skill, or maybe lacking some other complementary input, just don't have access to that larger, more efficient scale. So to put it another way, there's going to be some households in our sample who, even in the presence of microcredit, and even if they already have, even if they do start a business, they don't seem to exhibit the potential for that business to grow. But then there's going to be another subset of the population who we call GUNG-HO entrepreneurs, who do have the ability to move to this higher TFP, higher fixed cost technology. So kind of moving from the pedal operated sewing machine to the highly mechanized sewing machine. And so we'll show that it's for that second group of individuals who we are calling gung-ho entrepreneurs, for whom the relaxation of credit constraints are going to be most valuable in the sense of having these persistent impacts. Okay, so maybe I'll go over this relatively quickly, but I do want to acknowledge that we're certainly not the first to posit that heterogeneity across entrepreneurs is important. There's a large literature making this important point, including work that my co-authors Abji Banerjee and Emily Breza have worked on in Thailand, along with Rob Townsend and Diego Veracosio, work that Reshman Hussam, Natalia Rigol, and Ben Roth have done in North India, and others. You know, and this, yeah, I think the other piece of this that I want to draw attention to is that a body of work that I and many others have worked on before, which was documenting kind of average effects of microcredit using RCTs conducted in different settings, 6 papers of which were published together in the January 2015 AEJ Applied, all kind of paint a consistent picture of, on one hand, shall we say, muted impacts of and demand for microcredit. So on average, in the short to medium term, one kind of salient fact is that on average, microfinance does not appear to be transformative. But on the other hand, we do see that a non-trivial share of households, made roughly between a quarter and 40% across different settings, do in fact borrow for business investment at interest rates that are often in excess of 25% APR. So that's kind of a revealed preference argument that, at least for some of these individuals, the marginal return to credit invested in the marginal return to investment in their business is in fact positive. So heterogeneity does appear to be an important part of the story here. Okay, so I've already said a lot of this, so we're going to again think about these two different types: gung-ho entrepreneurs, which we're going to be able to measure in our data and I'll kind of defend a little bit later why I think this is a reasonable an a priori reasonable way to think about this. We're going to identify someone as a gung-ho entrepreneur if they already had a business when the microlender entered their neighborhood. So so you can think about this as someone who, in a setting of scarce credit and high interest rates, nonetheless chose to start a business there, which is kind of a revealed measure of having kind of high motivation to run a business, high marginal product of capital. Then the other category is going to be those who didn't own a business at baseline. Those are going to then comprise two different subgroups. As I said, the reluctant entrepreneurs, those are individuals who didn't start a business when microcredit was not available, but did start a business when microcredit became available, again, kind of suggesting that their marginal product of capital was lower than the pre-intervention interest rate, but above the post-intervention interest rate. And then other individuals who are just not interested in operating a business at all, who we're going to think of as consumption borrowers. And I'll kind of come back to talking about kind of what the profile of impacts look like for them. So by considering these two different groups, we're going to be able to kind of separately look at the intensive margin of business expansion, kind of what microcredit does for someone who already has a business, versus the effects of microcredit at the extensive margin, someone's selecting into business and starting a business for the first time. Okay, and then as I'll explain as we go on, this is going to be very helpful for us in terms of looking in the right place for empirical evidence of a poverty trap. Okay, so I guess before I preview the results, maybe pause for a second, see if there are any other questions. So I'll forge ahead. Okay, I'll forge ahead. I don't really have 91 slides. A lot of those are extra slides. Okay, so what do we find? Again, I've already anticipated some of this, but I'll say it again for concreteness. So when we compare the treatment and control group, we find that the treatment group, who had additional exposure to microfinance in the past, they exhibit that treatment group exhibits large positive treatment effects, but only for that gung-ho entrepreneur subgroup, only for those who started their business before microfinance entered. And I'll show you using quantile, showing you figures that summarize a bunch of quantile regressions, that investment is going to increase throughout the distribution, that profits, which are kind of, as some of you in this room I know will be well aware, profits, which are even more challenging often to measure than business investment, are going to statistically significantly increase for the top third of the distribution, roughly, consumption is going to increase for the middle 50% of the distribution. That this also has been an effect that's been sort of elusive in the literature. So we're going to see this kind of broad-based picture of effects, both in terms of positive business effects and also that translating into increases in consumption. On the other hand, for the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs, I'm going to show you that throughout the distribution, there's basically no evidence of impacts. I'm also going to try to convince you, if I have time, that this different pattern of effects is not driven by the fact that the pre-microfinance or the gung-ho businesses are by construction older. They were kind of by construction started earlier. And then I'll also show you, if time permits, that there's an important and interesting, to me, at least, interplay between microfinance, which is a form of formal credit, and informal credit. That microfinance and informal credit are going to be complements for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, meaning that when they get more access to microcredit, they're also going to borrow more from their social network. Whereas for the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs, formal and informal credit are going to be substitutes. When they get more access to formal credit, they'll decrease their demand for informal credit. Okay. So
can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
So you're looking into people that already own a business, okay?
Yes.
But that does create a concern that what you may be capturing, it's the fact that, for example, you have collateral to pledge from the business, other than your personal assets. So in some sense, I guess concern is that there will be other reasons than credit constraints that allow someone that already have a business to ask for microfinance.
Oh yeah, so absolutely, you're right. So that's absolutely right. I think I think in some sense what you're getting at is kind of in some sense is like the exclusion restriction of what we're talking. I think in terms of access to credit versus not, we have a very clean identification strategy because we have a treatment group and a control group. But exactly as you're pointing out, it's far from randomly assigned who started a business before the lender showed up and who didn't. The thing that I'll show you that I at least find compelling about, in terms of this kind of identification strategy idea, is that using the staggered rollout of the MFI through the city of Hyderabad and through the 104 neighborhoods in our intervention, what we can do is we can compare two businesses that started at the same point in calendar time. Let's say two businesses that both started in November of 2007, but one of those businesses opened up in a neighborhood where the microfinance institution hadn't yet opened. So that would be what we would call a gung-ho entrepreneur, and another opened up at that same point in calendar time, but because the lender arrived arrived earlier, they opened up after the lender showed up. So we would classify that as a reluctant entrepreneur. And I'll show you that even in that sample, so comparing two sets of households, both of whom have businesses that were started at the same point in calendar time, we see a quite different pattern of results for the gung-ho versus the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs. And to me, at least, that's the most compelling piece of evidence that we can present that this really is about who chooses to select into entrepreneurship in the absence of credit versus who chooses to select into entrepreneurship and only when credit is available. So I'll try to make sure to leave time for that because I'd love to get reaction.
Just one more detail. I don't want to jump ahead of time, but in those cases where you're using the staggered introduction, are you able to control for economic conditions in each area, like using region by year fixed effects?
Oh, so that's a great question. So this is all going to be within one large city, within the city of Hyderabad, and so we're going to have 104 neighborhoods of that city, and we're going to control for. And sorry, one other piece of information I didn't mention yet is that the randomization was done in a pair. So we formed. We stratified on some baseline variables, and we formed dyads, pairs of two neighborhoods, and then essentially flipped a coin to decide which would be treated and which would be control. And so we can control for strata fixed effects. And so to the extent that you are convinced by our stratification strategy, which formed strata based on similarity in baseline informal borrowing rates, baseline wealth as measured by per capita expenditure and population size, then I think those fixed effects are gonna, in expectation, control for any differences in places that the MFI would open earlier versus later. But yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah. No,
Cynthia, sorry to interrupt. There was a question. I don't know if it is solved. So Usman, you can talk if you wish. Phrase your question. Not sure. Yeah. I think. Yeah, Usman, if you can please ask your question, you can just voice it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering that the two kinds of entrepreneurs, the gung-ho and the other reluctant entrepreneur, like their incomes are the same at the baseline, right? Like they have been controlled for their incomes and wealth and.
Yes. So they. That's a great question. So when I show and so to be fully transparent, when I show you the evidence on like the aggregate group of gung-ho versus reluctant entrepreneurs, the differences are not so large as you might expect. I think I have a slide on this, but as you might, the gung-ho entrepreneurs are a bit older. I think they're a bit wealthier. But there again, this comparison that I was mentioning to Miguel a minute ago of what we call the overlapping sample, the businesses that open kind of at the same point in calendar time, but just differing on whether it was before or after the micro lender entered their neighborhood. Within that sample, they are, they are more balanced. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so to forge ahead a bit, but again, like these questions are great. So I hope they keep coming. Again, so far what I've told you so far is that we're going to look at the same intervention and argue that there's a large effect of this intervention on one group, the gung-ho entrepreneurs, and no effect on others. Now this is consistent with different possible stories. It could be that this is quote unquote just a story of increasing returns, that maybe in both of these groups, there's increasing returns, and one group, and actually this kind of relates to Usman's comment a minute ago, maybe it's just that no one in the reluctant group was wealthy enough to benefit from those increasing returns, and people in the gung-ho group were. Could be that. It could be heterogeneity. There could be no non-convexity. There could just be kind of two different linear technologies, and the gung-hos might have linearly high returns, and the reluctant entrepreneurs might have linearly low returns. Or, and I'm going to try to convince you that we actually need both of these pieces. We need there to be increasing returns, but also heterogeneity. Okay, and so I just want to start by showing you this is some new evidence that we've just been working on recently, trying to convince you that there's some just kind of eyeball evidence for the presence of this S-shaped curve. So what I'm showing you here on the left, the side of the screen that isn't blank, is the relationship between a measure of assets at baseline and a measure of, which is 2006, 2007, and a measure of assets at the third end-line wave of data about 5 to 6 years later in 2012. And so you can see, that there's, as you would likely expect, there's an increasing relationship between assets at baseline and assets at endline, but there's not evidence of this kind of S-shaped curve that I was telling you about earlier. Okay, so now I'll show you the corresponding picture for the treatment group. So 0 here is treatment indicator is 0, and 1 is that the treatment indicator is 1. And here we see, and I should say this is in fairly raw data that we've just plotted with a like lowest locally linear curve. We see just kind of some prima facie evidence for this non-linear relationship between baseline assets and endline assets. And as I'll show you a little bit later, this is very consistent with the model that's going to emerge from the structural estimation that we do later on in the paper, wherein you could think that there might be kind of an an uptick in this curve for the control group. It is kind of so far out in the distribution that no one's able to take advantage of it. And then through that lens, what microfinance seems to be doing is kind of moving lower that level A bar, kind of moving to the left, the point at which people can get over that non-convexity. And I'll come back to that later. Okay. So again, in control, it looks like there's just this low single steady state that people can access. Whereas in the treatment group, it seems that some entrepreneurs have escaped and moved up to that higher steady state. Okay, so so that's just kind of eyeball evidence. I think by itself one could think of other stories for where that pattern is coming from, and so to provide further evidence that this S-shaped curve, this poverty trap, is really what's going on, we're going to use a simple structural model to kind of further probe this. So we're going to posit a linear technology with a possible fixed cost. And I want to emphasize possible. We're not sort of forcing the data to choose a fixed cost. That's something that we're going to estimate from the data. And then we're going to also posit a standard decreasing returns concave technology for anyone who doesn't pay the fixed cost for this first technology. And that we're going to estimate the parameters of these two technologies using the first n-live wave of data. So we want to see households once the treatment group has had access to microfinance to kind of use that treatment control difference to get variation in capital and outputs. The data is going to, quote unquote, prefer a fixed cost, and the estimated fixed cost turns out to be close to the median value of estimated baseline wealth. If I have time later, I'll get into the gory details of why we have to estimate baseline wealth for most of the sample. Then with those production parameters in hand, what we do next is we simulate the model forward to see how, for individuals who start with the empirical baseline wealth and are endowed with these two production technology choices, how would their capital and income evolve over time? And what we find is that the estimated production parameters do in fact generate this S-shaped curve that gives rise to a poverty trap in the evolution of capital and wealth. And now, because I'm feeling risk averse that I might not get to this before the end of the time, let me see if I can, okay, here we go, great. So this is the transition diagram that comes out of, taking those production parameters that we estimate from the data and then simulating them forward in time using, using a standard model of households deciding between consumption and investment. And so maybe I'll just talk about this now because I may not get to it later. So the line in red shows you the transition diagram for the control group, for households who don't have access to microcredit. And you can see here that basically a household would have to be at least the 75th percentile of the wealth distribution in the control group in order to get over that non-convexity and access the high TFP technology. What microcredit does when we move people to the credit regime is that it moves the kind of neck of the S, if you will, it moves it from about the 75th percentile down to something like the 45th percentile, meaning that it's going to move, roughly kind of the middle third or so of the distribution to a point where they're able to, by taking advantage of credit, they're able to move into the regime where they can access that higher TFP technology. So I'll come because I haven't told you any details of how we do the estimation. This may not be very this may not make a lot of sense yet. If I have time, I'll come back to this.
Just one question. Can you just clarify what you have in mind in terms of production? What is production here? So can you just explain?
Oh yeah, of course. Right. So I think one thing that I should have said is that one thing that I should acknowledge is that this model is going to be incredibly stylized relative to our empirical setting. In our empirical setting, we have people who are fruit vendors and who are tailors and who are food sellers and who run grocery stores and who are rickshaw drivers. We have an incredible diversity of businesses, and we've kind of very reductively kind of reduced that to these two single production technologies that take some kind of homogeneous input that we're going to call capital, and that we empirically map to a combination of the wage bill, fixed assets, and working capital, and use that to produce income. And then your income, net of paying your wage bill and your capital rental bill is going to comprise your profit. So So through the lens of the model, production is this very stylized object where I put capital in and I get revenues, and then net of net of costs I get profits out. And then of course this is going to be kind of a gross simplification of the real empirical setting here, but I do think it captures something real about many of these businesses, which is that there is a fixed cost from going from a kind of a low capital intensity way of sewing clothes, or a low capital intensity way of making dosas, or a low capital intensity way of doing other types of production activities, versus investing more upfront, maybe in having a designated space for the business outside of your home, investing in more mechanization, and then moving to a different and higher TFP way of doing that same activity. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
I'm not sure it did. Okay, great. Okay, so I've showed you that estimated curve. If I have time later, although it's looking like I may not, also just in a quantitative sense, these estimated production parameters can replicate the empirically observed long-run treatment effects for the gung-ho entrepreneurs. But, and I think this is another, to me, interesting aspect of the findings, in order for us to quantitatively replicate those results, we need to take into account this crowd-in of informal credit that I mentioned earlier. That is, we need to empirically account for the fact that when these gung-ho entrepreneurs get more access to microcredit, they also significantly increase their demand for informal credit. And we need to take both of those things into account in order to kind of quantitatively, for the model to quantitatively match the magnitude of the empirical results that we see. Okay, so that was a long build-up, and I apologize. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the setting. Probably quickly, I'll show you the reduced form treatment effects, and then we'll see how far I get from there. Okay, so again, I'm going to go through this quickly because this is, I think in this audience, this is not going to be a surprise, but just kind of to help in thinking about external validity and think about what these results might mean in different settings. I do want to clarify that the lender that was our implementing partner in this intervention, called SPANDANA, implements standard, what are sometimes called like Grameen 1 microfinance contracts. So the microloans that we're going to be studying here had group lending with at least nominal joint liability. The joint liability doesn't seem to have been imposed very stringently in practice. The loans were 50-week maturity, so basically a year with weekly repayments and weekly group meetings. Loan size, the first loan given by Spandana was 10,000 rupees, which at purchasing power parity exchange rates is $1,000. I should have that in euros. I'm sorry, I don't. Or at market exchange rates, about $200. And the interest rate, these loans use a non-declining balance interest rate, but it works out to an annual percentage interest rate on the order of 25 to 30%. So you could think of this as kind of being similar to unsecured credit card debt at least in the US. I'm guessing maybe the credit card interest rates in Lisbon might be similar. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind is that these loans, both Spandana's loans and microloans in general, are characterized by very high repayment rates. In a sense, that's a good thing, but it does kind of reduce the incentive that MFIs might have to do any kind of screening or risk-based pricing. So this is a very one-size-fits-all loan product. Almost anyone who meets some basic criteria can borrow. Contract terms are identical across borrowers, and loan officers don't have incentives that would kind of incentivize them to screen some people in or screen some people out. And I think this is maybe relevant for thinking both about Miguel's question earlier and maybe also Usman's question earlier, in the sense of, I think the homogeneous nature of this microcredit product, and the fact that someone like an aspiring entrepreneur with a really slick business plan would get the same loan as someone who's borrowing for a new roof on their house. They would get the same loan and the same loan terms. I think this is relevant in understanding why we wouldn't see large baseline differences between those who do and don't have a business at baseline, for instance.
Cynthia,
okay.
can
Yes.
I just ask a question? So do you know how the groups are formed? Is there a
Sorry?
rule?
I'm sorry,
So,
could you repeat the question?
yeah, sure. How the groups are formed.
Oh,
So
how the
is
groups are
there a
formed.
rule by Spandana, or do people apply in group or
It's
individually and they are sorted?
Yeah, so it's a mix. Basically, at least at this time, the groups were between 5 and 10 members. The modal size was probably like 8 members, and people. In some cases, people would show up with a ready formed group, but if people didn't, they would sort of like put their name down, and then when enough people from the same area signed up, then they would be clubbed together into a group. So it was a mix of kind of self-selected versus more randomly comprised groups. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think this would be cool for all sorts of other ways, but in this data, we don't have information about how those groups were formed. So. Okay, so I'll go through this next bit quickly because I think I've sort of said this all already, but we're going to leverage the exogenous variation created by this randomized controlled trial that Banerjee, Duflo, Glenister, and I worked on and published in earlier work. So this is obviously not to scale, but imagine this representing 104 neighborhoods of Hyderabad that were selected by the MFI in 2005 as places they were interested in opening in. We randomized, and 50% of those neighborhoods were selected to be treated. So the green blobs represent the treatment group who got access to microcredit in 2006. Later, as was part of our initial agreement with Spandana, in 2008, after we had collected the first wave of end-line data, Spandana entered the remaining half of neighborhoods. So starting in 2008, all 104 neighborhoods were treated. And that was kind of assumed to then be the permanent new normal. But then in 2010, and this relates to something I've analyzed in more detail in other work, an event called the Andhra Pradesh microfinance crisis occurred, in which the microfinance was essentially outlawed by the government across all of, not just all of our neighborhoods, but across all of Andhra Pradesh, which included Hyderabad at the time. This was before Andhra Pradesh and Telangana separated. Okay, so
Cynthia, just a question.
Yes.
Question about the design. Okay,
Yes.
Is it possible to have spillovers across neighborhoods? Aren't they close to each other?
So it's a great question, and so in principle, yes, these neighborhoods are all some of them are quite close to each other. Many of them are kind of commuting distance from each other. Someone could live in someone could live in this neighborhood and work in this neighborhood, or live in this neighborhood and shop in this neighborhood, and vice versa. And in fact, just to shamelessly plug some of my other work that I have with Emily Breza, we have used this AP crisis episode to try to demonstrate that there are in fact spillovers through general equilibrium forces, through the fact that microfinance has positive equilibrium impacts on wages. I would argue, well, I guess I would say two things. One is that in this setting where it turns out that a relatively small share of people kind of are compliers with our intervention. So the first stage here, the percentage of our sample that's induced to go from non-borrowing to borrowing by being assigned to the treatment group is on the order of about 10 percentage points. So that's, or about 10%, not 10 percentage points, 10%. So in that sense, the first stage is relatively small. So to that extent, I don't think that in this setting, there are going to be vast spillover effects. And to the extent that there are, the fact that like our work shows evidence of positive spillovers, and there hasn't been, to my knowledge, much documentation of the empirical relevance of negative spillovers like business stealing. I think to the extent that there were some spillovers, that would make the treatment effects that I show you for the gung-ho entrepreneurs probably lower bounds. But that's a very reasonable thing to ask. Okay, so in the interest of time, and also maybe to try to incentivize you to read my other paper, I'll skip over talking about the AP crisis, except to say that it resulted in the relatively immediate and unanticipated withdrawal of microfinance throughout our study region in 2010. Okay, so so again, the identifying variation we're going to use is that original assignment to treatment versus control, but we're going to do that comparison largely using data collected in 2012. And so any effects that we see in 2012 will have to reflect persistent effects of past microfinance access, because as I mentioned, due to the AP microfinance crisis in 2012, none of these households were able to borrow from microfinance contemporaneously at that time. If that's not clear, feel free to let me know. And again, just to be to try to be really clear, the treatment group had 4 years with microfinance and then 2 years without it at the point that we measured them in 2012. The control group had 2 years of microfinance and then 2 years without it. So again, we're going to look at a relatively small difference in past microfinance access, and I'm going to hopefully convince you that had large and persistent effects. And so that's going to, at least to me, already be kind of empirically consistent with this idea of kind of poverty trap-like dynamics, where small past changes can have large persistent impacts. Okay, so because we're going to be using variation from an RCT, the estimating equations are going to be pretty straightforward. So I'll show you estimates of the average treatment effects. I'm just going to look at some outcome for individual I and neighborhood N as a function of the treatment status of neighborhood N. We'll control for these strata fixed effects that I mentioned earlier and an error term. And then I'll also show you, and this will be kind of more of the focus of whatever my remaining time is. Oh yeah, I need to hurry up. We'll look at heterogeneous treatment effects for the gung-ho entrepreneurs versus everyone else. So the effect beta 1 in this specification will be the effect of microfinance for the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs. Beta 2 will be the additional differential treatment effect for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, and then beta 1 plus beta 2 would be the total treatment effect for the gung-ho entrepreneurs. And then also, as I mentioned, I'll also show you some quantile treatment effects separately for the gung-ho and the non-gung-ho subsample. Okay, so let me forge ahead. So one thing to keep in mind, so just over 30% of the sample is classified as a gung-ho entrepreneur. It's a sort of coincidentally a similar fraction who have a business in 2012. Some of these gung-ho entrepreneurs will have closed their businesses, and other what we would call reluctant entrepreneurs will have started new businesses. Just under half of these businesses are managed by women. I think that's kind of worth it keeping in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that these businesses, and these are summary statistics for the control group, these businesses are on average quite small. So only a third of them have more than one worker, and only 11% have more than 2 workers. And then the sales and investment here are also relatively small, for instance, as a share of annual expenditure. Okay, so let me just delve into the results, because time is getting.
Can you just ask a question? I should have asked this before, but I'm sorry. So you're assuming that if you relax credit constraints, you have access to a better technology.
I mean, we'll try to empirically validate that, but yeah, but that's right. That's a testable assumption of.
So you're going to test that channel.
Yeah, so I'll show you, and if my hyperlinks were working better, I would try to show you now. But we can.
I'm thinking that there's at least one other channel that it's very plausible if you relax credit constraints, which is human capital. So you'll be able to hire better, more talented people.
And I'm totally open to that as kind of, and in fact, I would sort of think of that as like another dimension of investing in a better technology. And in fact, let's see.
So you consider that as also having access to better technology?
I would think of being able to, and again, I think that has this flavor, if you will, of having a fixed cost, both in the sense of I can't hire 0.2 work. I mean, I could have a part-time worker, but there are fixed costs with hiring a worker, especially someone outside of my family. I have to start keeping the books and keeping track of payroll, and maybe need to kind of organize the managerial stuff differently. Yes, so I would see that as a kind of a friendly amendment. And in fact, I'll show you in a minute that we do see that the treated group does hire more workers and have a higher wage bill. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just very, very quickly, just to show you that we have a first stage here. On the eve of the AP crisis, the treatment group was borrowing more from microlenders. They were more likely to have ever borrowed from a microlender. and they were, and this is, and one thing I want to point out, this is not strongly differential between the gung-ho entrepreneurs and the non-gung-ho. So if you look down here at the interaction between the treatment times GE, this, in other words, the story I'm going to tell you is not one where microfinance has different impacts for gung-ho and non-gung-ho entrepreneurs because only the gung-ho borrow from microfinance. That's actually not what's going on. We don't see systematic differences between gung-ho and non-gung-ho in their take up of microcredit. But then we'll see a kind of different picture as I'll show you later. So, you know, but then when we aggregate gung-ho and non-gung-ho, the treatment group had a head start. They're 11 percentage points more likely to borrow at the first end line. They're 4.4 percentage points more likely to have ever borrowed. And again, the amounts of treatment-induced microfinance are not different between the gung-ho and the others. Okay, so now coming to business outcomes, and this relates to Miguel's question just a minute ago. So again, in panel A, we have average treatment effects, and we can see kind of across all of these outcomes, we see it at end line 3. So in 2012, 2 years after the treatment group after both treatment and control actually lost access to microfinance, we see that the treatment group is doing persistently better. They're more likely to have a business, they have a higher wage bill, they have more assets, they have more expenses and revenue, and they have more profits. Now, if we look down here in panel B, you can see that with the exception of the wage treatment effect, these other treatment effects are largely driven by the gung-ho entrepreneur subsample. So the gung-hos are the ones who are seeing like quite large increases in profits, in revenues, and in expenses. If you sum beta 1 and beta 2, they're also more likely to have a business, and they have higher wage bills. Okay, so now let me just show you a few of these, and then I'll kind of triage and skip ahead and think about what I'll show you in my remaining time. Here, what I'm plotting here is quantile treatment effects estimated at every at the 5th, 10th, 15th, and so on percentiles of the distribution, the treatment effect on business profits for gung-ho entrepreneurs. And so again, as I mentioned, this average effect, which I showed you in the regression table before, is coming from quite large effects at the top of the distribution for the gung-ho entrepreneurs. Okay, so what do we see for the non-gung-ho? We basically see nothing. So we don't. I think there's kind of two things to highlight here. One is that we don't see positive treatment effects for the non-gung-ho at any part of the distribution. We also don't see negative treatment effects. We don't see evidence that these non-gung-ho individuals are being harmed by microcredit, at least in terms of business profits. I'll show you consumption in a minute. Here's business assets, which I mentioned earlier, is I think a little bit of a less noisy measure of business investment and business scale compared to profits. And so here you can see that pretty broadly throughout the distribution for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, investment in business assets is increasing from about the 25th percentile all the way up to the 90th percentile for the gung-ho entrepreneurs. In contrast, for the non-gung-ho, there's really nothing at all happening except for the spike up around the 90th percentile, which we tend to think this is kind of telling us something about a little bit of misclassification. These are maybe some people who kind of should have been classified as gung-ho entrepreneurs. Maybe they had a business, but then they were kind of forced by some exogenous shock to shut it down. Okay, so the gung-ho businesses benefit across these different outcomes. They have more assets, they have larger business scale, they have higher profits. The non-gung-ho, on the other hand, have no evidence of benefit, but also no evidence of harm. And I think I would argue that the fact that we see this increase, especially in business assets throughout the distribution for the gung-hos, suggests that heterogeneity is present. This isn't kind of just a story of increasing returns where the people at the very top in both subsamples are doing better. Okay, in terms of
sorry, can I just first? Isn't it surprising that you see no effect for the no gung-ho entrepreneurs? Because you may think that they may be competing with each other in the same neighborhoods, and as one benefits, the other may be hurt by competition.
Yeah, I think I think that's a priori very plausible. This idea of that the gung-hos, that we might expect the non-gung-hos to actually suffer. I think we don't see evidence of that, and other papers that have also kind of tried to look for this you know, I think understandably, because of the high interest rates of microcredit, this idea that there could be negative effects, either kind of direct effects of people, you know, borrowing and not understanding the high interest rates, or negative effects in the form of business stealing. You know, these are definitely important things to look for, and they're both in this sample and other samples. There doesn't appear to be evidence of that. And I think, you know, I think maybe one way to think about it is that for the non-gung-hos, you know, there may be kind of two offsetting effects. You know, that these businesses, although they have a low marginal product of capital, they may still have a high enough marginal product of capital to, you know, to at least just barely justify the loan, and that may be enough to kind of net out any kind of business stealing or competition effects. But that's a great question. Yeah. Any other questions before we're done? Okay. Okay. So now turning to consumption, what do we see? So if we look at the pooled treatment effect, pooling gung-ho and non-gung-ho, we don't see an average effect on per capita consumption as a whole. But if we look at durable consumption and business durables, we do see treatment effects that are you know, that are non-negligible as a share of the control mean. So for instance, the effect on durables is about 6. Sure I'm doing that right. Yeah, it's about 6% of the control mean. The effect on business durables is more like 40% of the control mean. So we do see these persistent effects. But then if we look at differential effects for the gung-ho versus the non-gung-ho, we can see, you know, you see kind of no effects whatsoever for the main effect, which is the effect for the non-gung-ho, and then we see these large positive differential effects for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, which at least for durables, translate into positive overall treatment effects. Okay, so then if I show you the plot of the quantile treatment effects, we can see kind of that, as I mentioned, roughly from about the 30th to the 80th percentile, we see a positive effect on consumption per capita among the gung-hos. And then I don't want to make too much of this, because sometimes people ask, you know, you do notice that at least the point estimate for the effect at the top end of, you know, at the like 90th percentile and above of the gung-ho entrepreneurs is actually a negative effect. I think one possible explanation for that pattern is that for these most productive businesses may have such a high marginal product of capital that it's optimal for them to kind of tighten their belts and really put every spare bit of income that they have back into their business. So that's at least one possible explanation. But again, that's not significantly different from zero. What about the non-gung-hos? Again, you know, this is a place where we might again expect to see if there were negative effects on the non-gung-ho individuals, in the sense that they had kind of borrowed imprudently and were having trouble, you know, and had wound up saddled with debt or something like that. We might see it here, but you can really see that nowhere throughout the entire distribution do we see any kind of evidence of a treatment effect on consumption for the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs, neither positive nor negative. Okay, so I'll go through this super quickly, and then maybe I'll start to wrap up, because I see that we're at the hour mark. But I did kind of flag.
We still have some time, Cynthia.
Oh, okay, great. I won't go
up to 20 minutes, and it will be fine. Sorry.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay, great.
Cynthia, I'm sorry, just a clarifying question. So these microfinance companies, they are just funding entrepreneurs. They are not financing other type of households.
Oh, that's something I should have mentioned. So some. Thanks, Maggie. Forgot to lock my door. Maggie, can you close my door? Sorry. Some microfinance institutions do at least try to screen on like having a business plan or having a business. SPANDANA and many other MFIs in working in South India, where the study takes place, don't try to do that. And at some point I had the opportunity to talk to talk to people in the management of some of these institutions, and they kind of have two arguments for doing that. One is that money is fungible, and I might say that I'm taking out a loan for my business, but really I was gonna buy that sewing machine anyway, and the marginal use of the money is actually for a television or something. And so that's one argument for not restricting lending to those who have businesses. The other reason is that, I think many of these companies realize that there can also be a benefit to non-business investment forms of lending. If I take out this loan and I use it to get medical treatment, or I use it to, pay for my kid's schooling that has a high lifetime return, that's also kosher. Yeah. So, but sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying that, but that borrowing both for business and non-business purposes is possible here, and we see
my concern is that if there is like a demand channel going on, because people borrow and then they consume. And
oh yes, and so that's a great point. And again, and in fact I think and in some of my other work, I think we see quite direct evidence of that. One thing I think here, in just thinking about the timing, so the results, the consumption results I'm showing you here, this is measured in 2012. So 2 years after anyone in the sample last would have taken a microloan. And so that kind of direct consumption effect, which to be clear, I think is there, and we see in other data that Kabosky and Townsend showed in the context of Thailand, that effect, to the extent that it's kind of a mechanical effect, would typically play out, like within the year of the loan, kind of, and so I think the fact that here we're seeing effects on consumption, 4 years after the differential access to microfinance for the treatment versus the control group ended, and 2 years after everyone lost access to microcredit, I think just the timing here means that effect is not what's going on. But in principle and in the short term, that is important, definitely. Okay. Okay, so maybe I'll just kind of show you, tell you this in bullet points, and then see if I can leave a few minutes for Q&A, and I can come back and show tables during Q&A if there's interest. But I do want to again kind of point out that of course microfinance doesn't exist in a vacuum. That before households had access to microcredit, they it's not that there's a complete absence of credit, but instead households are borrowing from various types of informal sources, which could be, what are often called money lenders or local lenders, but also friends, neighbors, shopkeepers through trade credit and things like that. And I think it's important to understand whether formal and informal sources of credit are complements or substitutes. If they're strong substitutes, meaning that microcredit, crowds out informal credit, nearly 1-for-1, then the effect of microcredit is not so much actually shifting out the supply curve of credit, but instead it might just be a marginal change in the interest rate. Whereas if these two types of credit are either kind of orthogonal or even more so if they are complementary, then increasing access to formal credit is going to kind of meaningfully shift out, the overall microcredit or the overall financial kind of access for these households. Okay, and so what we find, and I guess for now you can take my word for it, and I'll be happy to show you the tables during the Q&A, is that the nature of this interaction is different for the gung-ho entrepreneurs versus others. So for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, the treatment group exhibits large and statistically significant increases in their demand for informal credit. And this is something we analyze in more detail in another paper, no change in the size of their social network. For the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs, we actually see a different pattern. So we see decreased demand for informal credit, such that it looks like microcredit is largely crowding out informal credit. And then in other work with Banerjee Breza, Arun Chandrasekhar, and Matt Jackson should be here. That's embarrassing. He's also on this other project. We document that that among the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs in the treated group, they also exhibit loss of social network connections. So, so again, I think this is another reason why it's important to think about heterogeneity in the sense that if you offer a microloan to two individuals, for one of them, the microcredit simply crowds out informal sources of credit, that has different implications for welfare and what we might expect for business investment and so on than for another household for whom microcredit is either kind of orthogonal to or complementing access to informal credit. Okay, so let me I'm not sure where that beamer button is going to take me. Okay, so I did want to say a little bit about this because it came up in response to a couple of the questions. So I'll try to keep myself to like 5 minutes on this, and then I'll conclude. So as came up in some of the questions early on, I'm trying to convince you all that the pattern that I'm showing you in the data is strong evidence that these gung-ho entrepreneurs have access to these two credit technologies, and that gives rise to a non-convexity, and that's why we see these persistent impacts, whereas for the non-gung-hos, we don't. But again, coming back to this idea about the exclusion restriction, there are obviously other differences between the gung-ho and the non-gung-ho subsample. So if we think about a gung-ho business versus what we're calling an RE business, a reluctant entrepreneur's business, the gung-ho entrepreneur's business is mechanically going to be older because they had started it by the time the microlender entered, and relatedly, they're going to have more experience. And so it could be that we're, even though these are relatively long-term effects, we're studying these businesses about 6 years after the initial intervention. It could be that we just haven't waited long enough, and with more time, the reluctant entrepreneurs would catch up. They'd accumulate enough age, enough experience, and then they would then start to look at the gung-ho entrepreneurs. And then there's a separate concern, which this next exercise is also, I think, going to be helpful for, which is the following. Kind of by construction, among the non-gung-ho subsample, fewer of those individuals are going to start businesses. And so empirically, it's about 18%. If you didn't have a business at baseline, only about 18% of that subsample starts one by the third end line. So it could be that, so the interpretation I'm going to try to convince you of is that microfinance is selecting in worse businesses, but one could, you could say, well, no, maybe just, those reluctant businesses are actually just as good, but you're underpowered. Those results are harder to detect because they're averaged in with a lot of zeros. So to get at both of those explanations, I won't go into this in too much detail, we're going to use the kind of staggered rollout of Spandana throughout the neighborhoods of Hyderabad, and that's going to allow us to compare businesses at the same, created at the same time, but in one case maybe opened in a neighborhood where Spandana opened late, and so that would be a GE because they're going to open pre-microfinance, whereas in a neighborhood where Spandana opened early, a business created at the same point in calendar time would be a reluctant entrepreneur. And because of this match pair randomization that I mentioned earlier, we're going to infer that Spandana would have opened early and late in a control neighborhood, just assigning it the time when they did open in the matched pair treated neighborhood, if that makes sense. Okay. And so if this pattern of differential effects that I've been showing you is due to these confounding factors like age or experience or this extensive margin concern that not all reluctant entrepreneurs or not all non-GEs start businesses, then within this sample created at the same point in calendar time, we should see similar treatment effects in the two groups. So what do we see? So just to, I won't belabor this too much, but we're going to compare a match pair A where Spandana entered early versus a match pair B where Spandana entered late, and we're going to look at businesses that open kind of between these two points in time. A neighborhood like this is going to give us a treatment effect for non-gung-ho businesses because they open post-Spandana. A neighborhood like this is going to give us treatment effects for gung-ho businesses because they open pre-Spandana. Okay, so what do we see? So I'll just focus on column 6, which is just an equally weighted Klingkatz-Liebman style index of the business variables you see in columns 1 through 5. So panel A gives you the treatment effect for the gung-hos, the ones who entered entrepreneurship pre-Spandana. So these are kind of businesses in places where Spandana opened late. And we can see that aggregating across these 5 different outcomes, we see a treatment effect of about 0.15 standard deviations, a positive treatment effect. What do we see for the reluctant entrepreneurs? We see this isn't quite precisely estimated, although I think the p-value here is like 0.12 or something. We actually see a negative treatment effect. So this is consistent with this idea that the marginal businesses, the businesses that only open when microfinance is available, are more negatively selected and kind of have worse outcomes than the corresponding sample in the control group. Okay, so I won't kind of go into this in more detail, but again, I think the fact that we see this kind of sharply positive treatment effect for the gung-hos and a suggestively and marginally significantly negative impact for the reluctant entrepreneurs to me suggests that the exclusion restriction holds and that we're not confounding this gung-ho versus non-gung-ho with these other differences like age or experience and things like that. Okay, I'll skip this in the interest of skip this in the interest of time. And okay, I see we're almost at the 75-minute mark. So I guess I've sort of told you all that I'll have time to tell you about the structural estimation. I already showed you that figure that we think is quite cool, and I'll just go to conclude. Okay, so I think just to kind of tie this back to the overall debate about the role of microcredit, in the overall kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem in developing countries, there's these two common views of entrepreneurship. There's this gung-ho entrepreneur theory, which is sometimes associated with Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank. This idea that many, if not all, poor households have the interest and the potential to operate a potential business. And if that's the right kind of description of the world, then relaxing credit constraints could be expected to jumpstart firm growth. But there's an alternate view of forced entrepreneurship or reluctant entrepreneurship, as I've mentioned, where at least businesses that exist in this kind of state of the world have low profitability, limited scope for growth, and may be kind of a second best option in response to labor market frictions. And if this is the right description of the world, then relaxing credit constraints may have limited value, at least vis-a-vis business investment. And what I hope I've convinced you of today is that this isn't a either or description, but rather that both of these types coexist in the population. There are these gung-ho entrepreneurs who are constrained by lack of access to capital and for whom more credit can jumpstart firm growth, but they exist alongside reluctant entrepreneurs for whom that's not the case. Okay, and so so maybe we're at the 75-minute mark, so maybe I will wrap up. Just wrap up here, and again, thanks so much for your comments. And I guess there's like maybe six minutes or so left for any other questions or comments. But thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Well, I'll open the floor for questions. Maybe.
I have a question.
Please.
So in your previous paper where you study the effect of basically the introduction of Spandana, if I don't remember wrongly, the main effect was both on the removal of credit constraint, but also a substitution effect between formal and informal lending. So I'm wondering whether the effects you're explaining is not really a removal of credit constraint, but is more related to the fact that that lending is now becoming formal rather than informal.
I see. So. Right, I see. So that's, right. And so, just to, and, it's always, right. So I think that's certainly part of it. Maybe I'll use this as an excuse to show you that table about formal and informal credit after all, because I think that's likely to be part of what's going on, but not all of it. And so you can tell me if you think that this is kind of germane or helpful. So this, again, this is N-line 3 or 2012. So once microcredit is no longer available, so I'm not going to show you like a treatment effect, like a long-term treatment effect on microfinance borrowing for that reason. But if you look down here at panel B, we see that the individuals in the gung-ho individuals are, both on the extensive margin and on the intensive margin, they are borrowing more from informal sources, whereas the main treatment effect, the main effect, the effect for the non-gung-hos is negative. And so I guess the reason why I'm mentioning this in response to your question is that I do think that I do think that as at least for the for the reluctant entrepreneurs, what you describe is correct. They're kind of, as they get access, or, you know, or I shouldn't say is correct, but is a, I would say is a full characterization of what's going on. The non-gung-ho subsample here is, and I don't have the end line 1 and line 2 figures, although as you mentioned, they're in the earlier paper. They're borrowing more from microcredit and less from informal sources, and so for them it is kind of a move from more informal credit to more formal credit. At the same time, for that subsample, there's not a big treatment. There's not kind of an effect for that subsample on downstream outcomes. Oh, maybe I can show you one other thing here that I think is maybe helpful in this context. If I can, so these are treatment effects across time on various outcomes for the reluctant entrepreneurs. And so what you can see here is that, you know, I was focusing on the things represented by dots, the treatment effects in 2012, but the pattern for the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs in the earlier waves of data is the same. So even at the time when they were actively borrowing more from microcredit and borrowing less from informal sources, we're just not seeing the needle move very much on various outcomes for them. Whereas for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, the pattern is different. You know, the pattern takes time to manifest. So the end line 1 effects, which are shown here with the diamonds, in some cases are not distinguishable from 0, but then over time, those treatment effects on expenditures, on you know, the number of businesses owned, on revenues, increase over time. So sorry, I've kind of wandered a little bit afield from your original question, but I think that substitution from informal to formal is definitely there for the reluctant entrepreneurs. But I think that that's, you know, if we thought that that was mostly what was going on for the reluctant entrepreneurs, you know, it doesn't seem to be having an effect on their kind of downstream outcomes. Whereas for the gung-ho entrepreneurs, who are borrowing more from both sources, you know, so it's not an either or, you know, it's for them that we see this pattern over time. So I don't, anyway, that's a useful kind of framing, and I want to think more about that. Thank you.
Hi, Cynthia. This is Wayne Sandholtz. Really cool. So you've characterized this like the important heterogeneity here as a heterogeneity of type. You've got the gung-ho versus the reluctant entrepreneurs. And perhaps I've just missed something here, but I guess I'm wondering why is that characterization by type necessary? Like, if we just focus on like the basic poverty trap S-curve, like why can't it just be the case that these gung-ho entrepreneurs who we know have more assets like prior to the intervention, like for them, kind of the extension of credit allows them to get past a bar, whereas for what we're calling the reluctant entrepreneurs, it's just the fact that they don't have enough previous credit or enough previous capital for the intervention to move them past a bar. So I guess I'm wondering kind of why is the type heterogeneity important here, and what does it add to kind of the parsimonious S-curve model that we didn't have before? Okay, that's a great question. So tell me if you find this helpful or not. You know, I think that if the, you know, and again, this is somewhat of an oversimplification of what you just said, but if the underlying kind of relevant way to parse the data is one where there's like, yes, there are non-convexities, and that's kind of the main thing that's important, and this type heterogeneity was not so important, then I would argue that we would expect to see something going on, at least at the very top of the distribution, for these non-gung-ho entrepreneurs. Because while it is true that on average, the non-gung-ho entrepreneurs in aggregate are, you know, have a bit lower assets and at baseline and differ in some other ways at baseline or at end line 1. Also, I should say, because we don't have great baseline data, I didn't get into that. You know, nonetheless, some of these non-gung-ho households
are not, are relatively relatively well off, have relatively high assets. And so if it was like just a story of non-convexities and this type heterogeneity was not important, I think we would expect to see, more going on at the top of the distribution. And you might say, okay, well, there's maybe a little bit going on, at the very top. We interpret that more as misclassification, that this is somebody, like this, our relatively coarse proxy of who's gung-ho and not gung-ho is not going to be perfect. But but I think that's a fair, I think that's a fair question. Yeah, but I think just the fact that we see these effects pretty broadly through the distribution for the gung-ho and really nowhere through the distribution for the non-gung-ho, at least to me, suggests that this type heterogeneity is an important piece of the story. And again, I think, I mean, granted, these aren't quantile treatment effects. This is just kind of, this is just an average treatment effect for the two subsamples. But again, I think to me the differences among the subsample where we can even hold kind of like the calendar age of the business and things constant are also suggestive that the type heterogeneity is part of that we kind of need both of these pieces together to be able to rationalize the results. But yeah, that's a very, that point is very well taken.
Okay, cool. Right on. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe I can ask just a quick question. I know we are to the limit. So I was trying to compare these with this literature we have on cash grants to existing businesses. Okay, so I know it's different. So here, I mean, we could try and look at the GUNG-HO entrepreneurs and kind of compare the two. Yeah, so what these literature, I'm thinking the Blackman et al. Paper shows the Blackman.
Oh, Blackman et al. Yes.
So what they find is like after 9 years, so these effects have kind of disappeared, but the transitional effects we see are mostly concentrated on like females, younger entrepreneurs. So you don't have any data to look at that, do you? So that we could try and make this comparison.
You mean in terms of, wait, okay, sorry.
Who these entrepreneurs are?
That's a great, okay, sorry, so
we would need to know that in order to compare these kind of different effects, right? So the credit versus the cash grants, even though they are targeted existing entrepreneurs. So I'm just looking at this. That's, I think, where we should focus if we wanted to make a comparison, but we would need to know what are the characteristics of these business owners, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a great point, and something that we kind of just, because this, I mean, I don't literally have 91 slides of material, but like we already have a lot that we haven't really added. We haven't added that, but this question will finally convince me that, and I'll lobby my. Sorry, long way of saying we haven't really delved into what, because obviously like being a gung-ho or a non-gung-ho, this isn't like an essential characteristic that falls from the sky. Like this is clearly determined by other stuff, and we, yeah, to be honest, it's been on our to-do list. We have gender.
These dynamic effects are super interesting, but then it would be kind of interesting for us to compare with the recent literature that is more longer around effects of these business targeted interventions.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting angle on it too. That that would help to kind of to benchmark these results against. Yeah, no, so thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Can I ask one quick question?
Please.
Like it's a little live. It's not directly related to this paper. It's more related to like any RCTs of like where, like for example, for microfinance. Are these reports of accounting books, like their increase in assets or consumption, changes in consumption, are these self-reported? And are there any incentives for misreporting?
So the answer to the first question is yes. This is not a setting where like these businesses are too small and too informal that we would never find them in like a census of like a firm census or anything. And so the only data we have on these businesses is reported by the household itself. In terms of incentives to self-report, I think that's a good question. I mean, and to be fair, this is something that we worried a fair bit about early on, and we made a point to make it very clear that our data collection was not going to go back to the MFI. Like, we didn't want people to have an incentive to either over or underestimate their success to kind of increase or affect their future chances of getting a loan or of getting any other kind of a product. You know, I think like one form of kind of reporting bias that we worried about early on is that people who really wanted loans might have an incentive to try to make themselves seem more, you know, less successful and therefore more deserving of future loans. And I think to the extent that that was going on, that might actually, you know, at least at the first or second end line, lead the treatment group and control group to look more similar if people in treatment areas where there were these SPANDANA branches were trying to kind of look less prosperous. But I think the other thing that's maybe helpful, you know, for the results that I'm showing you kind of everywhere other than in that section where it's results in 2012, at this point, the microfinance sector is completely dormant here. And so there's going to be no incentive, I think, to misreport one way or another in the hopes of getting another microfinance loan, because the microfinance sector is quite dormant. But so, yeah, but I think that is a really interesting, that is a very interesting point. And we didn't do any kind of like, we didn't randomize the order of which questions we asked or anything like that. I think in some cases people might ask certain questions earlier or later in the survey where it might be more or less salient to manipulate responses, but we didn't do that kind of variation. But it's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we are really close to our end time. So thank you so much, Cynthia. This was really wonderful work, and thank you everyone for this.
Yeah, thank you all so much for the questions and comments, and I'm looking forward to chatting with several of you later. So thanks again.
Some of us, yes. Thank you so much. Then thank you.